So the Battlefield Hardline open beta was this past weekend, and there were lots of people playing. Slated for release on March 17th of this year, how well does it perform? In this video, I'll be benchmarking the Battlefield Hardline beta on my NVIDIA GTX 660 graphics card. For this test, I ran Battlefield Hardline on my main gaming rig to benchmark its performance on the GTX 660. The system has an AMD FX 9590 8-core clocked at about 4.72 GHz, 32 gigs of DDR3 RAM at 1600 MHz, and the game was running off an SSD. I had a few programs open in the background, kind of simulating what my normal workload would be because it was my normal workload. Had a couple Word documents, some Chrome tabs, etc. The game was of course running at 1080p 60 Hz. You're not going to get much more with this card. And I cycled through various presets, low to ultra, including auto. I had motion blur set at a comfortable 15% for me and FOV at 95 through 100. All my matches were below 60 ping, so just a frame of reference of what I was testing with here. So how well did it perform? Let's take a look. Running only on low, the minimum frames were down to 43. However, the average set around a very comfortable 80 frames per second, and the max stacked up to 113. So running on low, it's going to be absolutely playable. Running at 80 frames per second is going to be more than enough for a 60 Hz monitor. Like I said, you're not going to be running 144 Hz or 120 Hz on this graphics card anyway. And you can even enable VSync and sync it up to 60 frames per second and probably have no problem whatsoever. Jumping up to medium, and the minimums drop down to 33, although I believe that to be primarily due to hiccups, just that occasionally happen, as I never once saw 33 while actually playing. The maximum stayed around 114, and the average frames only dropped down to 71. So again, totally perfect and comfortable, playable frames per second. Drop some VSync on there, and you're going to have a solid 60 frames per second no matter what. If you leave it on auto settings, however, which is between medium and ultra, at least for me, it has various settings that go between medium and ultra. Minimum frames dropped to around 36, however the max was around 78 and the average was 57. So running it on auto, you're getting about 60 frames per second on average. However, your results are going to vary depending on your computer because it changes the auto settings based on that. Certainly wasn't a solid 60 frames per second, but it was pretty close. Interestingly enough, if I just forced it up to high on my own, the minimum frames went up to 40, the maximum frames went up to 123, which is higher than both low and medium. I'm assuming that's due to the various respawn menus and things like that. However, that maximum was always there whenever I did all of my tests. And the average was around 64, so that's hovering around a solid 60 frames per second playable state running on high. Ultra minimum was at 30, max was only at 66, and the average hung around 45. So overall, it's perfectly playable up to high, averaging above 60 frames per second when it occasionally drops down to the 40s. Perfectly playable. If you can tolerate stuttering and 30 frames per second shooter gaming, you could play it on Ultra. However, the stuttering and just lack of frames is probably going to cause you some trouble in the game. I was quite impressed with my experience playing on high, however. It felt pretty smooth. Big drops were only experienced when purposefully spinning around really fast looking at the skyboxes or getting killed. For whatever reason, in most Battlefield games, there's a hiccup when I get killed. That's when I know I'm dead, even if it doesn't show me dead yet, as I'll be shooting and then it'll drop 10 frames and then I'll be dead. This happens in most Battlefield games for me. I don't know if it happens for everyone else. But overall, the high playing experience was very nice. However, 2 points contradictory to each other are very important to keep in mind here. A, this is only a beta, so overall graphical performance has probably not been polished very much, and in theory this means the launch release could be quite a bit better in terms of graphical performance. But after BF4's launch, I can't entirely trust anything to be better on launch, because Battlefield 4 certainly wasn't. B, this is only a beta. Therefore, they didn't necessarily give us the full graphical impact of the game. I know with Battlefield 4's beta, they gave us heavily compressed textures and graphics. With Hardline, they didn't necessarily give us as compressed. However, they likely are compressed and the particles dumbed down a bit. So, on release, the graphics could actually be better, which also means performance is going to tank a little bit. But honestly, Hardline looks about in line with Battlefield 4, which probably means they're running it on the same engine, which is kind of disappointing. These numbers alone don't necessarily mean a whole lot, so how do they compare to Battlefield 4, since I did say that I do think it looks like it's running on the same graphical engine or just maybe a slightly upgraded one. For Battlefield 4, low minimum frames were about 55, so almost 60 at the minimum. Max were up to 127 and average were 79. Medium, the minimum frames were 56, actually a little bit higher than the low settings. Max frames were at 121, averages were at 69. Running it at auto, you had 45 minimum, maximum at 71, and an average about 58. So that's about a 60 frames per second average. Again, playable. And as we saw with Hardline, pumping it up to high, you got a 47 minimum frame rate, 85 max frame rate, and the average was above 60. Throwing it up to Ultra, your average is down to 45 with a min at 32 and a maximum at 62. So overall, the numbers are almost exactly the same. Battlefield 4 performance is a little better in the low and medium ranges where it consistently stayed at higher maximum and average frame rates. However, that's not going to make a huge difference overall. Hardline had a much higher max spike that it kept hitting no matter what test I ran on the high setting of graphics settings on Hardline over BF4, but overall performance was about the same. Like I said, they're basically running the same graphics engine, so it's going to perform about the same. So if you're a GTX 660 owner and you want to play Battlefield Hardline, you're not in a horrible place come launch. Running at playable frame rates up to high, as long as you're on a 1080p 60Hz monitor, you'll be okay. If you're wanting to push beyond 1080p to 1440p or even 4K or a 144Hz monitor even on lower settings, it's not going to be a very viable option. Also, recording at a clean 60 frames per second probably won't happen either. Thankfully, the newly launched GTX 960 is intended to be the upgrade option path for the GTX 660, skipping over the second 760 option, because usually these cards last about 2 generations before you really need to upgrade to just the same line of card. So they're both about $200 to $300 cards. Jumping from the 660 to the 960 is the intended upgrade path. So you might want to look into that if you're really wanting to get the most frames out of Battlefield Hardline come launch. I hope you enjoyed this video. I don't do benchmark videos often. That's primarily because I'm running a GTX 660. But I wanted to try my hand at it again and bring it to you. Leave a like if you liked it. Hello, I can't talk today. Leave a dislike if you disliked it. Leave us a comment if you plan on getting Hardline or plan on upgrading for it, what you think about Battlefield Hardline. Be sure to check out our support links in the description below, as well as a way you can give back to the channel, social media links to stay up to date with us, and as always, be sure to subscribe. Catch you in a future video.